Hitler's great gamble on the Western Front began in December 1944. The Ardennes campaign achieved nearly complete surprise, but quickly bogged down, and by January the German goal of reaching the strategic port of Antwerp was out of reach. And yet fighting continued, some of the most brutal conditions on the Western Front. In the midst of this battle, an elite American unit, the U.S. 17th Airborne Division, experienced their first taste of combat near the village of Flamierge, Belgium, at a nearly forgotten place called Dead Man's Ridge. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The National Museum of the United States Army explains that Army airborne units were developed to support the concept of vertical envelopment, or the ability to strike an enemy from behind when ground forces could not go around prepared defenses. Born out of response to German successes in Holland and Greece, the U.S. Army grew its airborne units from a small test platoon in 1940 through battalion and regimental combat in North Africa and Italy to multiple combat-ready divisions by D-Day. Following the invasion, airborne troops would be deployed during Operation Market Garden in the Battle of the Bulge, and earned a reputation for changing the battlefield as soon as they entered it. The 17th Airborne Division was one of 5 U.S. airborne divisions constituted shortly before and during the Second World War. The 17th was activated on April 15, 1943, and originally consisted of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which had been constituted the previous December, and the 193rd and 194th Glider Infantry Regiments. Among the men of the 513th was Isadore Jachman. Jachman's background would have been rather different than most of his fellow troopers. He had been born in 1922 in Berlin, Germany. According to a blog post by his cousin, Isadore's father Leo had been born Leib Jachmanowicz, one of 12 children of a Jewish family from Kalisz, Poland. He had moved to Berlin and changed his surname to Jachman. Isadore was his first child, with his wife Leah, or Lata. In 1924, Leo moved with his family to the United States, living in Baltimore, where the couple had 2 more children. While Isadore grew up in Maryland, 10 of his father's brothers and sisters remained in Poland. Isadore was a champion weightlifter. An April 1941 edition of the Baltimore Evening Sun described him as the star of the Young Men's Hebrew Association weightlifting team that was competing for a championship of the South Atlantic Association of the Amateur Athletic Union. Leo told the Sun in 1950 that everyone called him one of the best weightlifters in the state. He was the unofficial champion of Maryland. The Sun wrote of him that, like his father, Isadore Jachman was not tall, but was a powerful young man. He graduated from Baltimore City College High School in 1939 and began studying physical education at the University of Baltimore. He enlisted on November 17, 1942. According to his enlistment record, he had completed a year of college and was skilled in mechanics and repair. A 2021 post on the website of the United States Army says that after completing basic training, he was stationed stateside, but decided to volunteer for the paratroops. The website says, as a German Jew, Jachman still had plenty of family in Europe, so there was no question where his loyalties lay, with his adopted home, not with the Nazi party that had taken over his native country. It's unclear what Jachman's family knew about the fate of their relatives in Poland at the time, but according to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, 6 of Jachman's aunts and uncles died in the Holocaust. Parachute training was particularly rigorous, as would be expected of elite troops, but retired Lieutenant General Edward M. Flanagan, Jr. explains in his 2002 book, Airborne, A Combat History of American Airborne Forces. There was no lack of volunteers for parachute duty, even though both the standards and the washout rates were high.
They're trained to battle in any part of the world, in any climate, on any terrain, desert or snow. The training is tough. So is the job.
The U.S. Army Parachute School had been established at Fort Benning in Georgia. The 4-week school included former paratrooper Edward Pershing Good told Detroit Area 4 News in 2018, physical training, lots of running, push-ups, squats with logs, followed by training on how to do parachute falls and controlled jumps. Flanagan explains that jump practice occurred on various devices at Benning that generations of paratroopers have come to remember with respect, if not fear. These included 250-foot towers on which paratroop trainees made their first controlled jumps, and 34-foot jump towers that gave the trooper the sense of opening shock of the 28-foot canopy. Good said it was perfectly harmless, but it was the hardest thing to do. You fall maybe 10 feet, then you get caught by the cable and bounce. This was harder than the 250-foot tower, because at the tile tower, you had no choice to make. Lots of people quit at the point of the 35-foot jump. The jump training was valuable beyond the parachute. Flanagan quotes Lieutenant William P. Yarborough of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. The challenge of jumping from an airplane in flight or descending onto a hostile landing zone on an aircraft without an engine would be paralleled later in life-or-death situations for which airborne soldiers had already prepared themselves by identifying and strengthening their own psychological assets. The men of the 17th Airborne began jump school in October 1943. But while the men of the 17th Airborne were prepared for combat, they might not have been prepared for what came next. The Allies always struggled with the best way to use their elite airborne divisions, and the first to be deployed were the 82nd and 101st Divisions into Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. But as the Allies fought across North Africa, the 17th was still in America, training. High airborne casualties in the July 1943 invasion of Sicily then called airborne tactics into question, as American commanders wondered whether large-scale airborne formations were too difficult to control. The 17th participated in Operation Knollwood in North Carolina in December 1943, the success of which allayed concerns and convinced Army leadership to continue plans for large airborne operations. The 17th had completed training by March 1944, but when some 13,000 Allied airborne forces participated in Operation Neptune, the Allied landings at Normandy in June, the men of the 17th were still in the United States. The 17th didn't ship out until August, arriving in Liverpool 8 days later. The division was in England in time for Operation Market Garden, an airborne operation in the Netherlands, launched in September. But command decided that the 17th didn't have enough time to train for the operation, and that their equipment from the U.S. had not been fully consolidated. The 17th was kept in reserve, left behind in England, while the Allies deployed some 41,000 airborne troops from more than 3,600 aircraft. And then even more waiting. The Allies wanted to save their elite airborne units for special operations. And as winter rolled in 1944, the 17th was still in England, part of a strategic reserve. It seemed that they might not see combat until the spring, when an airborne operation might be planned. But the Germans had other ideas. The website of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard Museum explains, on December 16, 1944, the Germans began their last major offensive in the West, in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. The 406,342 men of Army Group B slammed into the unprepared forces of the Allied 12th and 21st Army Groups, creating a bulge in the Western Front in an effort to break through and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Whole American infantry regiments were captured as German Kampfgroups slashed through weak points and encircled positions. Panicked and in desperate need of reinforcements, Allies leaders decided to deploy the theater reserves. These were the airborne divisions. The 82nd and 101st Divisions were already in Europe and were quickly trucked into the fight. The 101st Airborne, along with the 969th Artillery Battalion and parts of the 10th Armored Division, were surrounded and besieged in the Belgian town and critical crossroads of Bastogne. Despite being terribly outnumbered, the battered bastards of Bastogne held until troops of the U.S. Third Army broke through the German encirclement on December 26th. But the 17th had been limited both by weather and lack of transport, and did not arrive in the Ardennes until December 24th, when over a period of 3 days they were transported to France. The website Skyans of the 17th Airborne explains the 17th was undergoing further intensive airborne training when the news of the German breakthrough in the Battle of the Bulge was received. Units of the 17th were rushed to the Reims area of France by air and spectacular night transport landings. These elements closed in on Montmelon, and after taking over the defense of the Meuse River sector from Givet to Verdun on 25th December, the 17th moved to Neufchâteau. Then they moved through the snow to Moret, relieving the 20th Infantry Division on 3 January 1945. But the men of the 17th had still not seen combat, and it seemed that they had arrived too late for the Battle of the Bulge. Skyans of the 17th Airborne explains, General Patton, who had just taken command of the sector, believed that the Germans, when stopped at Bastogne, were in full retreat. Patton ordered the 17th to attack, under what Skyans of the 17th Airborne described as appalling conditions of snow and fog, with poor intelligence, no air cover, and inadequate artillery support. The St. George, Utah Daily Spectrum reported in 2013 that Patton told General William Bud Kiley, commander of the 17th, there would be little resistance. But Patton was wrong that the Germans were in full retreat. The website of the Portsmouth Naval Museum writes, Hitler, incensed by the failure of his troops to take the city, ordered remaining forces to attack and close the gap as soon as possible. With a lack of good aerial reconnaissance and continued bouts of foul weather, the advance ordered by General Patton would run headlong into this counterattack. 17th Division veteran John Corman was quoted in a 2010 edition of the newspaper The Oklahoman. What Patton didn't know was that we were actually attacking a German army that had been heavily reinforced with 2 Panzer armored divisions. He had no way of knowing, and that's what we walked into that day. The men of the 17th would experience their first taste of combat there in Belgium, in a battle that became known as the Battle of Dead Man's Ridge. The Oklahoman quoted Paul Wilson of the 17th's 193rd Glider Infantry Regiment. The orders came quickly. There was this heavy layer of fog and mist over the area, so we didn't jump in. We were trucked in. In fact, we walked most of the way. I saw some dead GIs frozen on the side of the road as we went in, and I remember thinking, this is for real. Private Albert Bryant of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment described the artillery barrage that greeted the men of the 17th on the morning of the 4th on the website Battle of the Bulge Memories. Just as it started to get light, the Germans started an artillery barrage on our position. We are not safe in our foxhole because the artillery shells were going off in the treetops and raining shrapnel down all around us. There was snow on the ground, and every time a shell hit and exploded, it left a big black ring in the snow about 50 feet across. I wondered at the time if the black ring represented the killing zone. When it happened again, I was glad to see one trooper get up and move out of the black zone on his own. It was at this moment that I first experienced the sound of a bullet passing directly over my head. I dropped to the ground and landed on top of my gas mask, and when I saw how much the mask elevated my hind end, all I could think of was that I was going to get my ass shot off. I didn't think twice about discarding the gas mask. There, in the cold and the fog, their enemy exposed themselves with a massive barrage of heavy machine gun, artillery, and mortars. The website of the Portsmouth Naval Museum writes Company A was sent reeling, with men diving for what little cover they could find in the farmland as German gunners began targeting individual positions. By the time Company A was withdrawn from the attack at 11:20 a.m., the 130 men attached to the unit were in tatters. Company A mortarman Paul Wilson put the survivor count for the company that day at 16. Skyans of the 17th Airborne writes that the Germans hurled dozens of tanks and heavy barrage of artillery at the attackers, and many casualties were inflicted on the lightly armed troopers. The 2,250 yards of narrow, high-rend road northeast of Bastogne rightfully earned its nickname of Dead Man's Ridge. Attacking in a driving snowstorm, the division battled for control of the ridge. It was a bitterly fought battle that saw the 17th suffer close to 1,000 casualties during the 3-day battle. Lightly armed paratroopers and glidermen, at times in waist-deep snow, were fighting German tanks. The airborne troops were lightly armed and had limited weapons with which to combat the German armor. Bryant recalled that when our bazookas fired a missile and it hit one of the tanks, it might knock off a little metal, but no real harm was done. We had a trooper dug in with a bazooka about 40 feet in front of us. He fired the bazooka at a Tiger tank, and the tank fired back, and our trooper was directly hit by an 88mm shell. One of his body parts landed near me. Among those facing the tanks was Company B of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, in which Isadore Jachman was a staff sergeant. The website of the U.S. Army describes how his company was attacked. On January 4th, 1945, Jachman was with Company B in Flamierge, Belgium, when they were suddenly pinned down by heavy fire, including artillery, mortar, and a barrage of fire from 2 enemy tanks that quickly inflicted casualties on his unit. Jachman saw his comrades were in desperate need of something that would help them. And instead of staying where he had taken cover, he jumped up and ran across the open ground, despite the gunfire. He grabbed a bazooka from a fallen soldier and moved towards the tanks, which had begun concentrating their fire on him. Skyans of the 17th Airborne explains when 2 German tanks broke out of the dense fog and threatened to overrun the 513th's position, Staff Sergeant Jachman recovered a bazooka from a fallen comrade and single-handedly engaged the 2 panzers. He knocked one out and caused the other to fall back. The website of the U.S. Army writes, his bold move disrupted the enemy's attack, which saved Company B from complete decimation. But the act was his last. The Baltimore Sun wrote in 2007, as he began firing at the second tank, he was cut down by machine gun fire, dying from his wounds. He was 22. The 17th took terrible casualties, but the website of the Portsmouth Naval Museum explains sacrifice on what was to become known as Dead Man's Ridge was not in vain. While the encounter with heavy German forces was unexpected and catastrophically violent, the unintended counterattack by the 17th Airborne checked the German advance, stalling and ultimately preventing their drive back towards Bastogne. Nearly 1,000 Americans were killed or wounded over the course of what would become a 3-day engagement before the Germans were finally repulsed. The Baltimore Evening Sun reported Isadore Jachman's death on April 10th. For his sacrifice, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. But in 1950, Maryland Senator Herbert O'Connor heard the story of his action and asked the Adjutant General to review the award. Upon review, it was upgraded to the Medal of Honor. By date of action, it was the first Medal of Honor to be awarded to a member of the 17th Airborne, and only the second to be awarded to a Jewish soldier in the Second World War. Today, his Medal of Honor is cared for by the National Museum of American Jewish Military History in Washington, D.C. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.